run the joint. Yeah.
Nah, that's debatable.
Yeah,
but,
thanks for including me.
But I did this one, so.
This was really
yeah.
great. Look at
Oh,
this
thank
turnout.
you. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Jamil was, he's my buddy.
I forwarded it to him, and I know he couldn't come because
I
of his
know,
current gig,
yeah.
but otherwise he would have been asking questions.
I always say Jamil's the guy.
We are snug. We're snug in here, yeah.
Emails me again at 6 a.m. and asks why I haven't responded
I
yet.
know.
I know, he's my favorite. That tiny little table. All right, we're about to get started again. There's still a lot of seats in the front too, so I encourage people to fill in as much as possible. I'm going to just start it off. I'm Russell Wald. I'm the Senior Manager for External Affairs here at the Hoover Institution. For our next portion of today's conference, we will focus on the law and civil liberties of Section 702. I'm going to do a very brief introduction of our esteemed panel and then turn it over to our moderator. First, I would start with Julian Sanchez, who's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of technology and privacy. Alex Abdo is the senior attorney with Columbia University's Knight First Amendment Institute. Formerly, he was a senior staff attorney at the ACLU, where he has argued cases before federal court related to NSA surveillance. Next, we have Susan Hennessy. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution and the managing editor of Lawfare. Previously, she served in the Office of General Counsel at the National Security Agency. And closing that out, we have the General Counsel with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's James Baker. And our moderator for this session is Shane Harris, who is a senior writer on intelligence and national security and cybersecurity related issues at the Wall Street Journal. He is also author of a fantastic book on cybersecurity issues titled At War, and that's with the @ sign, which I highly recommend. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shane.
Okay, thanks everybody. Can you hear us okay? All right, we're here for a nice cozy panel this afternoon. Thanks very much for having us here. I will say personally, just as a journalist covering Section 702 and related issues, the civil liberties questions have really been the most top of mind. I think certainly for most Americans and certainly my readers has long been a top of mind. So I'm very pleased to moderate this panel, and we've got a terrific group of people up here. So I'm going to talk and moderate a discussion here for the first 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to some Q&A. So please, we want to encourage a dialogue with all of you. So please think about questions that you want to ask, and we'll get to as many of them as we can towards the end. So I actually want to start with Jim Baker. I think, not to put you in the spotlight or anything, I think you may be the most senior representative of a government agency here, so you get to stand in for the interests of law enforcement maybe and national security in this. I just want to start with sort of a basic first order question, which is, can you just explain to us, in plain English, why Section 702 authorities are important for the work that the FBI is doing? I mean, what is the sort of the baseline that you come at of why this is an important capability that I presume you will say needs to be reauthorized?
Well, Shane, thank you, and thank you to the Hoover Institution for having us here, so I appreciate that. 702, as Matt Olson was saying on the last panel, is vital to the FBI and to the intelligence community. It provides us with a wide range of foreign intelligence information, especially including actionable intelligence, stuff that we can actually do something about, and so that's critically important for us. It is something that the FBI takes in and combines with other information that we have lawfully acquired, just as we've lawfully acquired the 702 information, and we pull that together in order to connect the dots. This is what everybody's heard since 9/11. It was one of the key findings of the 9/11 Commission, telling us that one of the flaws was that the government did not adequately connect the dots. And so the FBI combines 702 information with all the other information that we have, and we check our databases against it and try to figure out, when we get a tip, when we get a lead, when we get information from a variety of different sources, what do we have in our existing holdings about a particular matter, a person, an email address, that kind of thing. And so we use that to guide our investigations, to ferret out what it is we need to focus on, what the threats are, and move forward. So it's vital to our day-to-day operations.
Is it? We'll get to this, I'm sure, but it's something that I think you would argue that without it, what would it look like without it?
Well, we could talk about how I'm not going to propose other legal methods that we could.
No, sure, but it's like it's taken away today. What's the landscape look like for the FBI?
So if it's completely taken away, then the FBI is losing a vital source of collection on very important targets. We try to be very focused at the FBI. I'm speaking just for the FBI. The FBI is very focused on which targets it asks the intelligence community to target, or to what selectors we ask the community to target. Because first of all, we have to make sure, it's required, that any of our selectors are associated with a full investigation, meaning the highest level of predication that we have in order to open an investigation. And so if we were to lose it altogether, we would lose vital collection on a range of very important targets. It would also deprive us of dots. Right? It would deprive us of lead information. It would deprive us of an ability to connect people to threats, to connect threats to particular individuals, and to ferret out exactly what's going on.
Susan, recently the NSA has amended some things under the 702 program, particularly the collection of so-called about information. Walk us through a little bit of what that means and what you think the practical reasons for doing that were and what the effect of that may have been.
So I'm nervous to say this. I see some familiar former colleague faces, so hopefully they won't be shaking their heads that I'm getting it wrong or something. Right, so this is a highly publicized decision that the NSA announced, I think, about a month ago, a few weeks ago at this point, to essentially voluntarily end what's known as about collection. So under 702, there are two forms of collection, upstream and downstream. Within downstream, there's only to and from collection, but within upstream, there's another category, about collection. I think I'm citing the numbers correctly, that upstream accounts for about 10% of 702 collection, and about collection within that is 0.02%. The former Deputy Director of NSA, Chris Inglis, wrote a very comprehensive paper on this, and I think those are the statistics that he cited. So NSA announced that following a number of compliance incidents, they decided to voluntarily end this practice. So this set off a series of controversies. First, because NSA had in the past represented that this was important and vital and necessary, and so there was some criticisms that that was somehow not an accurate representation because now they didn't need it anymore. I don't think that that's quite the right way to view this. We know about collection does pose a particular heightened risk of collecting domestic communications, so domestic communications that happen to mention the particular target that might not just be a U.S. person's name, but a U.S. entity, right? So American Airlines, right? You can imagine the particular utility of that form of collection. In recognition of those heightened risks, there were additional safeguards created in order to try and mitigate against the risks. There was a series of inadvertent compliance incidents. These occur, they happen. They're very serious. The fact that they're accidental is not, doesn't minimize their significance, although it is quite relevant to the current discussion. Those were self-reported to the court, so we're seeing exactly the process that we want to see, compliance incidents being detected, being self-reported. Then a determination was made that rather than invest the cost of coming into compliance, right, doing the things that were going to be necessary to ensure those compliance incidents wouldn't occur again moving forward, it was better on sort of a cost-benefit analysis to just eliminate this form of collection. Now, NSA has said that they are not able to eliminate this form of collection without also losing other important information. So they're saying that there is a cost here. This is about risk management. So again, this is a process that we want to be seeing. We don't want intelligence agencies to sort of take a collect it all, just let's get everything we can. We want this kind of voluntary and ongoing assessment because this is such a critical area. That said, I think it's a little bit of an illustration of some of the potential perils here. And that's whenever we evaluate sort of the difference of NSA saying it was a necessary program and worth it previously, and in this instance deciding to no longer go forward with it. It's in examining the cost-benefit analysis, as we add costs, eventually costs will outweigh the benefits. We know that's true for everything. Even if you take sort of those core vital parts of the program that Matt Olson was talking about, if we put enough costs there, that will outweigh. And so I think this is why, in this instance, I think it was a prudent decision, the appropriate judgment, but I don't think that we should sort of take for granted the notion that there aren't real costs here, and there aren't costs as we put on additional reporting and technical requirements.
Just one more question on the compliance incidents. How do we know they were accidental and inadvertent?
So we know because there was a declassified court decision that while it was extremely critical of the NSA on a series of metrics, was quite clear that it had no indication that there was any sort of intentional malfeasance here.
So Alex, let me turn to you. So we have a program that the intelligence community says is vital, responsible for a large amount of intelligence, but it appears that the intelligence community is willing to, I guess they would see it as, amend the program when they feel that it's made mistakes or it's gone too far. I mean, when you look at this amendment on about collection, is that satisfying to you from the civil liberties perspective, or is that, would you read that more as sort of a token gesture, considering that this is, as Susan said, responsible for a fairly negligible amount of information in an already small portion of the overall program?
You know, I think it's hard to know what exactly to make of it, given that the NSA, for example, hasn't disavowed that they will in the future reseek this authority. They haven't explained technically what has changed about the way in which the NSA is engaging in upstream surveillance. They've eliminated this portion of it, but there are a lot of technical questions that go along with that. And it raises, I think, a different question. You know, I have a slightly different take than Susan on what it says about the NSA's prior representations relating to the vitality of this part of the program to Section 702 more broadly. When the PCLOB was examining 702 for the report,
the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board.
Right. When that oversight board was examining 702 for the report that it issued, it focused pretty heavily on about collection, because that was one of the more controversial forms of collection. And based on representations made to that board by the NSA, they issued a report that said that it was a technical necessity to conduct about surveillance in order to be comprehensive in even to-from surveillance. And they made it sound as though it were vital. So while I agree with Susan that it's, at the end of the day, a question of cost-benefit analysis, the NSA's previous representations made it sound as though the benefits were too high and the cost of losing it were too high to ever consider losing that. And now, almost on a dime, they flip and eliminate that authority. But again, it's hard to know what to make of it, given that they haven't disavowed an intent to seek it in the future. Susan's right to point out that the reason we know about the compliance incidents with it is from this court order. The only reason why the court order knew what to publish about these compliance incidents is because it was self-reported by the government. So we have the government's representations about the scope of the problem and the whether it was accidental or not, but we certainly don't have, I don't think, a full adversarial sense of the story.
So does it feel to you then that this modification, which was obviously portrayed as a very big concession, is actually just a token gesture? I mean, I know you say it's hard to know, but what does your gut tell you?
My guess is that the temporary cost, the kind of present cost of bringing the program into compliance with what the FISC wanted it to be, the NSA decided were too high at the moment, and that it's preserving flexibility. And my guess is that if Congress suggests codifying the end of about collection, if Congress suggests amending 702 to prevent the NSA from restarting about, my guess is that the NSA will vigorously oppose that. But I think that would be the ultimate test of whether this is a gesture or something more.
Julian, you're one of the, I think, the better explainers of not just intelligence policy and surveillance law, but you articulate the civil liberties component of this as well. What are we really worried about here? I mean, so we're hearing about a program that provides these massive capabilities, has huge compliance, is, as Jim Baker said, it's very targeted, very focused. I mean, from your perspective right now, as we're heading towards the end of the year and the question of reauthorizing this, what are the top of mind civil liberties issues that you think that, people in this room in particular are going to have to confront?
Sure. I mean, I think the central concern always with intelligence authorities is the political misuse of intelligence that is gathered. So it's a somewhat different set of concerns than from what primarily arise in the sort of the criminal surveillance context. And there are sort of two halves to that. One is a sort of insufficiently accountable intelligence community serving its own interests using the data it's collected. And we think here, of course, of the sort of the somewhat caricatured image now of J. Edgar Hoover with his personal and confidential files, essentially yanking the leash on his nominal overseers, using the power of the information he'd amassed about them. And the other issue, of course, is the insufficiently autonomous intelligence agencies staffed by loyalists to the administration in power, using it as a tool to gather political intelligence about their opponents or to torpedo political adversaries. And one reason I think 702 sort of raises a special concern about that is just that the scale of everything has magnified so dramatically. So if you think back to the kind of intelligence scandals that were exposed in the 1960s and 1970s, these involved first, sort of labor-intensive, deliberate targeting of people like Martin Luther King and anti-war activists and civil rights leaders. And also, because it involved specific targeting of that kind, abuse that was after the fact, the sort of thing you were likely to notice. I think at one point in the 70s, then Attorney General Ed Levy noticed that there had been a decade-long wiretap on the offices of the NAACP and said, well, are you indicting or what is it there for? And so we were able at least to shut that down. And one reason 702 is so disturbing is you're talking about every year somewhere between 90 and 100,000 foreign persons having their communications targeted for interception, dumped into a massive repository, probably on the order of some billions of communications annually now, and then being stored for years at a time. So the concern isn't just will there be improper targeting of someone of the kind that might be easy to detect and then to trace back if that information were misused. It's, do you trust that this sweeping kind of black hole aperture that's sucking in stuff is not only not going to be improperly targeted in its inception, but won't be properly used after the fact. And especially when you have these kind of endemic compliance issues. That is, when the kind of formal procedures designed to constrain access to this data are being routinely ignored, as it seems increasingly is the case with the court being informed months or years after the fact. It's very difficult under those circumstances to detect abuses when they do occur, because the abuse part, under circumstances where you've got that massive database, is about what someone knows when they leave with that information and what they do with it after they leave the office. And that's the sort of thing that after the fact is extraordinarily difficult to track. So my concern is, the potential for a reprise of the bad old days of intelligence abuses, but with a much diminished ability to detect it when it happens.
Let me kick back over to Jim and Susan just on this particular point, because Julian's raising this issue of compliance being routinely ignored, and I think this has precisely been the fear of many people on the civil liberties side, that yes, you have this extensive, exhaustive, some might say, compliance regime, but there is this ability to ignore it. So respond to that idea. I mean, is this something that is being routinely ignored? I mean, or is that an unfair characterization in your mind?
It's completely unfair. Nobody ignores the law. Nobody ignores the policies and the procedures that exist under 702 or the other parts of FISA. I mean, that's not the culture of, certainly at the FBI, that's not the way we operate, that's not the way we manage, that's not the way we lead. And people are expected to comply with the law and comply with directives and the rules, basically. People make mistakes. I mean, we're a human enterprise involving complex technology. So tell me where else in society there are not mistakes involving humans and technology, right? And so the key is that there are multiple overlapping layers of compliance run by a variety of different folks. So for the FBI, right, we have Department of Justice, we have the ODNI, we have the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, we have the FISA court, obviously most importantly, and we have Congress conducting oversight, having hearings, the staff members come and get briefed and so on. And so there are multiple levels of oversight that are there to prevent exactly what Julian is worried about. And I understand why people are worried about it. And you know, whenever the government does anything with respect to the collection of communications regarding Americans, people should focus on that. People should think about it, and people should make sure, the American people should make sure that there are adequate protections in place and that there are the right people running these organizations. So that's true. But what I would say is it's just not how we operate. Mistakes are made. We try to correct them. We try to identify them and then figure out what went wrong and correct them.
Susan?
Yeah, so I do think it's a tremendously unfair sort of characterization, certainly of the current sort of discussion, right? So the entire set of rules that we're debating right now are designed to prevent exactly the kinds of abuses that Julian describes, recognizing the seriousness and the gravity of sort of those historical abuses, right? This is part of the reason why these laws were passed in the first place. The first, I think, sort of mischaracterization is the notion that there are all of these citizens outside the, foreign citizens, and the United States intelligence community just kind of collects them willy-nilly. And so there's, while that's not a constitutional issue, like there's something inherently wrong and indiscriminate about that. This is collection that takes place for a foreign intelligence purpose. It's highly articulated. This is not warrantless surveillance. It's a sort of I think best understood as kind of a modified warrant requirement because of the operational equities. So it's not, 90,000, 100,000, what the number that is collected. Those are collected for a purpose and for important purposes and purposes that Congress and the courts and the executive branch all recognize and agree are important purposes, right? That's the functioning of our system. The other sort of thing that I think is a misunderstanding is to think that compliance is really just NSA figures out that they made a mistake and then they decide whether or not to tell the court. Compliance is a multi-layered apparatus, right? So there's baked-in technical elements of compliance. Those are designed to avoid mistakes occurring in the first place, but also create conditions in which when mistakes occur or when intentional violations occur, they're detected. There's also daily reporting that occurs between overseers and DOJ. There's an entire level of rather sophisticated, and I think some might even say intrusive congressional oversight. And then, of course, on top of that, there is the annual certification process to the courts. There's also inspector generals, right? So there's quarterly reports that are produced for the inspector general. So there are, despite sort of the characterizations that occurred after the Snowden disclosures, there actually hasn't been sort of credible allegations that NSA has ever not approached those mechanisms in good faith. And so I think this really is a debate about everybody is approaching it in good faith. There are the possibilities for very serious abuses. Everyone recognizes that. And the question here is, how do we best design a system that's going to prevent exactly this sort of situation?
So, yeah, let's say, okay,
so
good faith, no one's doing anything wrong, and we're all in this together. What's wrong with that?
I mean, I think a couple points. One is that I think that, few people are in a position to question the good faith of the way these programs are implemented. The one institution that is perhaps in the best position is the FISA court, and the FISA court has repeatedly questioned the good faith of the NSA and the FBI in implementing this program. I just want to read two sentences from the most recent opinion from a few weeks ago. It said, the court is nonetheless concerned about the FBI's apparent disregard of minimization rules and whether the FBI may be engaging in similar disclosures that have not been reported. The improper access seems to have been the result of deliberate decision-making. And that's not a unique sentence. You can find sentences like that scattered throughout the Fisk opinions relating to this. But for me, the bigger scandal is not failure to comply with the processes that we have. To me, the bigger scandal is that the processes that we have are so permissive in permitting wide collection of U.S. persons' communications. The aperture that Julian pointed to is one that allows the NSA to collect in a warrantless fashion, and I do think it is in fact warrantless. Almost any foreigner could be the valid subject of surveillance under 702 because the requirements are extremely minimal. They need to be a foreigner abroad, and they need to be suspected of having information about the foreign affairs of the United States. That could cover journalists, could cover human rights activists, could cover all of your, the colleagues you may work with internationally or the sources that you report on internationally. And for the Americans who are swept up in that wide aperture, the main protection are these minimization procedures, and those themselves are riddled with exceptions. Not the least of which is one that we haven't really discussed yet today, but is backdoor queries, by the FBI and other agencies, in part for things unrelated to foreign intelligence.
Spend a little time on that, and what is the evidence, if any, that that's occurring?
Well, so the FBI now has the authority. The FBI now gets raw data collected under Section 702, and they have the authority to query the records that are collected for identifiers associated with specific known U.S. persons. So they have this enormous database that they have now collected as a result of the wide aperture that Julian described, and they can then dip into that database and query it for any U.S. person's name, and they can do that at any point in the investigative process. Not just a highly predicated criminal investigation, but a threat assessment, and look for evidence of criminality unrelated to foreign intelligence. And I think that that's in my view, an end run around the Fourth Amendment. And the primary defense that is often offered, I think it's there's a phrase that Jim used a minute ago, and similar phrases that were used earlier today, is that once the government lawfully acquires information, it can do with it whatever it wants. And I think that's a myth. The government's ability to do what it wants with information has always been closely tied to the purpose of the collection in any context of surveillance. And a really quick, good example. The Supreme Court a couple years ago addressed the question of whether local law enforcement can collect DNA of arrested suspects. And the Supreme Court ultimately blessed this DNA collection, but it was critical to the Supreme Court's ruling that this DNA was being used only for identification, not for looking into the genetic health of these people, for detecting familial connections with other possible suspects. And if the FBI the next day said, well, today we're going to use this DNA for a different purpose, I don't think anyone would say that's like consistent with the original purpose, or blessed just because there's some notion that once in, always in. So that to me is a bigger concern than even the compliance incidents, which I think are significant.
So I think there's sort of 2 points if I can respond. So the first one is sort of the characterization of the language of the opinion, which I think is right. It's accurate. This is a highly critical and in some cases quite fairly critical opinion that I think reveals a rather robust and muscular FISC, despite sort of characterizations of the court being a rubber stamp. When there are compliance incidents, that's very, very serious, and anytime there is failures within this system, that's serious, and the executive branch should be held accountable for that. What's not alleged in that opinion is that, and I'm not sort of deeply versed in the underlying circumstances. I certainly don't have knowledge from within NSA about it. But that the essential concern here was that there was, the rules said that databases had to be segregated whenever you were only allowed to search particular databases under certain conditions, and that those databases were searched under the wrong conditions. There was never an allegation that anyone knowingly searched a database that they knew they weren't supposed to be doing. So this goes to the basic sort of questions of good faith, and within that, it's important that we have this really sort of searching and critical inquiry to ensure that all the steps of the process are occurring correctly.
Let me ask a quick question on that. Once that, what is you're describing as an inadvertent error was discovered, were the databases and the systems changed so that would not happen again? I mean, what is the correction mechanism that takes place after a compliance incident is noted?
So again, this is getting into sort of particulars of which I'm just not qualified. The ordinary process is when a compliance incident is detected, it is investigated, it is reported through the various obligatory compliance mechanisms, and then there's an understanding of whether or not technical changes can be made to ensure the compliance incident doesn't occur again, or training changes or other sort of elements. In this case, instead of deciding that the prior protections were insufficient and that new protections should be created, it was decided that whatever the cost of those new protections were going to be, changing the way systems were designed, I don't know, that it was better in this case, because of the value of the program, to simply stop that form of collection. So I think that's why I really think it's important to focus on the inadvertent nature, not to underscore, not to pretend as though it's not very, very serious, but to sort of to be fair about what we're talking about. The other sort of element is the characterization of incidental collection. We talk a lot about incidental collection in 702 because that is where the constitutional rights of U.S. persons are implicated. So this is important. But there's also a little bit of a presumption that incidental collection is specific to foreign intelligence surveillance, or that it's inherently bad. Incidental collection is a part of all forms of surveillance. Even when you go to, when the FBI, not operating as an intelligence agency or DOJ, goes to a judge and gets a warrant and targets a particular individual's communication, they collect the other part of that communication as well. It's an inherent feature. And so, and then in that context, a series of protections are applied in order to ensure that that incidentally collected part of the conversation is handled properly, and that the rights of those people are recognized. The same thing is occurring here. This is a different context. There are different constitutional obligations, and there are different operational equities. But what we are seeing is the same that same instinct, an attempt in order to recognize the rights of people and to protect the rights of people that are swept up not as sort of a necessary evil, but just because that's part of how surveillance works.
So I want to go back to what Alex quoted from that FISA court opinion talking about, I forget the exact language now, but essentially a willful disregarding of the compliance procedures by the FBI. Jim, you're the FBI's lawyer. How does the Bureau and how do you respond to that?
Well, in general, if there's evidence of something like that, I won't speak about that particular instance today, but we take appropriate action internally, and that can range from a variety of things. If there's some type of intent or, malfeasance of that nature, that could result in some type of personnel action, but we'll also look for, is there a training problem here? Is there a management problem? Is there a technical problem? And we go through it and try to figure out exactly what is the problem, try to address it, fix it, so that it doesn't occur again. These things are not acceptable to us in any way, shape, or form. I mean, there's no way, period, full stop, right? I mean, that's it. They're just not acceptable. But it's a big organization with a lot of things going on, and we, and in a highly changing environment, because the technology is changing and how the adversaries use technology is changing, and so we're adapting to that. And so it's as the FISA court says in that opinion, it's a large and complex operation, the 702 operation. And so there are things that happen, and we don't accept them, and we try to fix them.
Julian, you got us started on this line of debate here, so I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the things that you've been hearing.
So I'll say a couple things quickly. I mean, one is just that, at least in particular domains, you do, I think, find a pattern of noncompliance that rises to the systemic level, that isn't one or two malformed queries, but it is a systematic problem. We saw it in the Fisk opinion pertaining to dissemination of data collected under the 215 bulk telephony program and the related 214 bulk internet metadata program, where they found that the minimization procedures, the restrictions on dissemination of U.S. person information had been so systematically violated that the overall regime that the Fisk had imposed to govern that data had effectively never functioned. In the most recent opinion, there's actually a whole sort of appendix of a series of compliance issues. One of them finds that a particular query tool that was accessing some of these databases, they looked for queries pertaining to people targeted at 704 and 705, two other related sections of FISA, that at least pertaining to this tool, 85% of the queries were non-compliant. So that is to say, much more non-compliant querying was going on than compliant. Now, that's one particular domain, but it suggests, I think, the problem that I think is also responsive to Susan's comment, which is because of the scale and complexity of this, errors tend to scale. One of the other things the FISA court references is the issue of not being able to quantify some of these problems, precisely because not all of the tools used to query these databases are interfacing with NSA's audit system. Now, an audit system that not everything, that doesn't actually cover all the tools that are used to query is not that useful, because that's the first thing, right, that's going to get used when something untoward is happening. So at some level, I don't want this to be an argument about what we think of the good faith of the large majority of people currently employed in the intelligence community. I'm willing to accept that when we're looking at these sort of systematic problems, that they are a function of the size and complexity of the operations. But when the surveillance being conducted is so large and complex that you have these repeated systemic failures of the rules put in place to govern them, that needs to broach fundamental questions about whether these are systems we are comfortable existing at all, because precisely that kind of complexity and that kind of frequency of error makes it so much easier to conceal when actual wrongdoing happens. And we know that previous abuses were not done without measures taken to conceal what was going on, right? The abusers of intelligence authority in the past were aware of oversight mechanisms and took steps to evade them. So when you have a scenario where either complexity or error are causing systematic violations, we can expect that that's where intentional violations are likely to hide and unlikely to be detectable.
Sorry, Julie.
Are you done, Julie?
I'll just the last thing I'll say is that Susan's of course right that incidental collection is right universal in surveillance, right? Even when you're physically searching someone's house, you might find correspondence with other people. I think the scale of collection here makes things different, right? Because at least in the criminal context, when that surveillance happens, usually there's minimization in real time. So there is an effort up front to filter out what's actually stored and recorded. And you don't usually have this massive federated database where all of the fruits of those searches, pertinent or non-pertinent to the subject of the investigation, are stored indefinitely. So I think the scale of collection and the searchability of the data in massive volumes makes the issue of incidental collection much more pressing.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, just real quick before we leave this topic. So in this lengthy analysis, 99 pages I think it is, of the FISA court that we've been talking about, in which they take us to task for these compliance incidents in very blunt terms, as Alex was reading, right? Very blunt terms, very critical. Nevertheless, in light of all that, or notwithstanding all that, or in recognition of all that, the FISA court concludes that the program overall, as run, is lawful and constitutional. I mean, they see what's happening, they understand what's happening, and nevertheless conclude that what we're doing is permissible under the Constitution and laws of the United States. That's what they conclude.
Okay, so that's a good pivot. We've spent the first part of this discussion looking at the utility of the program, the debates about it, the issue of compliance, whether it's robust enough or not, all of which are important things that people in Congress are going to have to grapple with when reauthorization comes. But now I want to talk about the real thing that's going to decide the reauthorization, which is politics, and particularly a lot of, I think, the optics that have been surrounding surveillance law that I have to say, as a journalist covering this for a long time, I find kind of head spinning. So what am I talking about? The phrase unmasking has sort of entered the lexicon before Confefe took it over. I can't resist. So this issue of U.S. persons showing up in intelligence reports and their names being unmasked for whatever purpose to try to understand them has been brought up in a number of hearings in the context of whether or not Obama administration officials inappropriately unmasked people who were identified in surveillance reports and who have now had their names leaked to people in my profession. I find this sort of kind of head spinning for two reasons. One, the kind of surveillance in which this is alleged to have occurred did not involve 702, as far as I'm aware, and lawmakers who are bringing up these concerns are saying we're going to have to look at this when we consider reauthorizing Section 702. And you find that many of the people who are very skeptical about these authorities now are very much from the camp of people who 8 years ago were very much rushing to enact Section 702 and amend the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. So there's been a bit of a shifting nature in the political alignment here. Let me just start with, Julian, let me start with you. I mean, what do you make of the fact that now this issue around unmasking, which is its own issue and is very much embedded in all of these surveillance capabilities that we talk about, has become this kind of political hot button at this point? And what does that portend for months from now when debate is up on whether to reauthorize this particular authority?
Yeah, I mean, it's very surreal to watch a series of legitimate concerns about surveillance authorities being raised for what are in the particular instances usually sort of frivolous or bizarre reasons. So I think we're watching this kind of odd train of that. With respect to unmasking in particular, at least in terms of the question of whether sort of rules were followed here, the sort of specific circumstances here seem like exactly the kind of circumstances in which it's pretty easy to understand why unmasking might be appropriate. That is to say, if you're talking about reviewing transcripts or intelligence reports about agents of a foreign power discussing their attempts to suborn or influence someone incoming into a senior position in the U.S. government, yeah, of course it's relevant to assessing the significance of that intelligence to know who they're targeting. So that's not particularly surprising, and I'm not surprised that at least the internal reviews have found that the unmasking that occurred was mostly appropriate. That said, I mean, in a broader sense, I do think we ought to, even if you're not particularly enamored of the Trump administration and think there may well be something meriting serious concern about their relationship with Russia, whether that's election interference or something else, I think it ought to be concerning that we are seeing an almost constant drumbeat of very obviously selective leaks targeting members of the administration, that the folks who are reporting them are usually hard-pressed to evaluate the significance of, independent of whatever context is provided by the people who are choosing to leak. It may be that is something that people are choosing to do because the process at this point has been so compromised that they're fearful that a legitimate investigation won't be able to proceed otherwise. But the idea that unelected persons have the power to so effectively derail an administration, even if you think maybe in this case it's the extraordinary circumstance where it's justified, the idea of that becoming normal ought to really concern people, because a lot of politicians out there have something embarrassing to hide, and so it should be concerning that there is a sort of subset of the government bureaucracy that has the power to decide whose skeletons end up on the front page.
I mean, is that just to carry on for that for just briefly a second? I mean, do you consider that to be just the next iteration of the kinds of abuses that we saw that led to these surveillance laws in the first place? I mean, government authorities using their extraordinary power to punish people, essentially, as punitive kind of actions.
I mean, there's a range of different things you can do. One thing I think to worry about, that's the sort of freak out in some of the sort of fever swamps of online media about deep state coup or conspiracy against the Trump administration made of Obama holdovers seems pretty overheated. On the other hand, when you see this onrush of leaks right after the firing of Comey, you do have to look at that and say, well, how much of this is maybe legitimately people who now think this investigation is going to be compromised, the only way to get the data out is to leak it, although still, of course, illegally. On the other hand, how much of this flood of new leaks is about a peremptory firing of a beloved FBI director in a manner that many people, I think, correctly saw as insulting? Motives are often mixed that way. I mean, Mark Felt, who turned out to be Deep Throat, was obviously exposing serious wrongdoing by people affiliated with the Nixon administration, but he was also probably substantially motivated by annoyance at having been passed over for the directorship, which he had expected to fall to him. So it's very often difficult to disentangle sort of public-spirited from venal motives for that kind of leaking.
Susan, let me turn to you. I mean, you've written extensively, and you and I have talked a lot about, the leaks that have come out, what it shows or may show or suggest about the way that this administration is operating and before it came into office, and are, I think, inarguably things of public interest. But they seem to be issues that may be imperiling the passage of 702, or certainly making it more difficult, which you clearly believe would be a very bad outcome. So how do you see the political sides taking shape as we go into this sunset period?
So I think there's a few things. First, there's no indication whatsoever that any of this information is 702 information. Not to say it's not relevant to sort of the general protections, but it becomes important in how we think about the various risks of these programs. Look, we should be candid. U.S. persons' information that is incidentally collected in the course of foreign intelligence surveillance is collected for a particular purpose. Leaking it to the media is an abuse, and leaking it to the media in order to gain a political advantage, even if it's to harm a president that you really think is a bad person, that's an abuse, and it's not wrong in like a it violates classified information sort of technicality. It's actually wrong.
It's a crime.
It's violating not just security protections, but civil liberty protections. And so people who care about civil liberties, they should care about that. It's not as clear to me, I wouldn't want to imply that those came from the FBI or any particular thing. There's lots of parts of the U.S. government, including political components, that have access to that kind of information. But we have to be candid and clear and accountable in how we talk about it. That said, sort of related to both the focus on leaks and sort of the, I would say, manufactured unmasking controversy. Certainly it appears manufactured given the information that we have now, is that it has actually begun to undermine important elements related to 702. And that's particularly whenever we look at members of Congress, including members of the intelligence committees, asking questions in hearings that evidence that they don't understand the difference between Section 702 and Title I of FISA. Very, very different programs with very different levels of protection. It starts to become more difficult to offer as a defense of these programs, well, there's very robust congressional oversight. Now, the reality is members don't always know everything, and they have very, very competent staffs. But whenever we are asking Congress to serve as proxies for us in these really important areas, to be our eyes and ears, and then they are demonstrating a lack, not just of sophistication, but of basic knowledge, either they're doing it cynically for political purposes and faking that they think this unmasking thing is real, or even more troubling, they actually don't know the difference. That's where I think it starts to bear on the 702 debate, because that's such a critical component of the protections here.
So, Alex, whether or not these lawmakers are arriving at their conclusions or suspicions about the way surveillance is operating because of ignorance of how the law works, or just sort of an opportunistic kind of moment here, this is raising the, kind of head-spinning possibility of the spectacle of Trey Gowdy and Devin Nunes joining arm in arm with the ACLU to modify Section 702. How do you feel about that?
I will say this. I'm not as deep in the politics of this, but I will say that one benefit of the kind of rapid change of the last couple of months is to very vividly instill in people, or very quickly instill in people, a measure of distrust of government that I think is actually essential to democracy. I think it is important for citizens to have the distrust necessary to want to hold their leaders to account, to want to hold their elected and unelected officials to account. And I think too much distrust can be corrosive, especially if it's not grounded in fact. And I think that is that's not something that I find beneficial to anyone. But a sufficient measure of distrust, I think, is important. And the truth of the matter is that the surveillance authorities that we have enacted since 9/11 have been extraordinary surveillance authorities. It's an extreme amount of power we've given to the executive to spy on people, including Americans. And the people who will exercise those authorities are not just elected officials that you will always trust. And it's important to build those tools in ways that are robust enough to withstand the possibility of political abuse. Because while I agree with Julian that it seems as though the vast majority of the problems that the FISC has identified with the implementation of 702 and other programs are likely the result of complexity and not the result of bad faith. The question isn't what any particular administration is going to do with the authority, it's what the next one will do, the one you don't know. And right now we have that one that nobody knows, and I think that's why people are so concerned.
If we're just, I know you say you don't do the politics as much, but if we're just breaking this down to brass tacks, is the civil liberties community going to be okay with finding allies where they would not have naturally expected them, even if those allies came to their side through a fundamental misunderstanding of what the issues are?
I think all the communities that act in this area have been opportunistic in their alliances. When I was at the ACLU, the NRA supported one of our key NSA lawsuits. And we welcomed the support of the NRA because we had kind of shared fundamental principles on this issue, and it made sense to have that alliance. So to the extent that people are coming to the prospect of surveillance reform because of this distrust, I think that's a good thing. To the extent that there might be broader consequences for our society in a more corrosive distrust because of the spread of misinformation, I think that can be a real cost, and that's not what I'm blessing.
Okay. I want to get the last question here to Jim before we move to Q&A. And you're not a politician either, right? And eventually, the new director and the director of the NSA and other officials will have to go to the Hill and make these arguments about why they feel reauthorization is important, presumably will. As your job, though, as in all of this, as the general counsel of the FBI, what is your job in that whole process?
To make sure that the FBI receives excellent legal advice. That's the main thing. I mean, I think, I guess I would say a couple different things. Obviously, 702 is a law, and so there's a heavy legal element to all this, and so I will be heavily involved in that process, both within the FBI and within the interagency. At the end of the day, just sort of to wrap up some of these things. I mean, look, I've said this before. Director Comey said this many times. You should not trust the government. You should not. The American people should not trust the government. You should not trust the FBI. We have a lot of power. We have a lot of authority that you've given us. Let's keep that straight. You've given that to us. But you need to hold us accountable. You need to hold us accountable for what it is that we do. And I would say to you on this program, there are a lot of mechanisms that exist to do exactly that. Our effort, I think, at the FBI is to try to explain to folks what this program means for us, how we use it, and to inform the American people and Congress that if you make certain changes, what will happen. And so, just to not to go into too long, but if the coverage, if the 702 were to be completely repealed, for example, or if there were this warrant requirement that's been talked about imposed in particular on the FBI with respect to the database checks that we do, that would have significant operational impacts on us. That would make it much more difficult for us to connect the dots. That would increase the risk of something bad happening to the people of the United States. And so I think what Congress and the American people have to decide is, okay, given that, is the benefit that we would obtain from a civil liberties perspective, does that benefit outweigh the potential costs? That are difficult, the potential costs are difficult to quantify sitting here today. But we can tell you, in our judgment as professionals, they would be there. The costs would be there. It would be harder to do our jobs. It's up to Congress and the American people to decide whether they want that or not. And our job, my job, is to try to explain what that is so the Congress and the American people can make an informed decision as this debate goes through for the rest of the year.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes now for Q&A and for discussion with all of you. So please raise your hand. I saw your hand first, and we'll come this way too. And when you, do we have mics going around or no? Okay, well, we'll speak loudly. And please let us know who you are when you ask a question. Thanks. Oh, we have a mic for you right here. Okay, sorry. Say your question again because of the reporting.
I want to get more discussion from both the civil libertarians and the FBI on the spillover into domestic issues. That is, when you collect foreign intelligence and then the FBI uses it for something that is purely a potential domestic crime. And that's part of a larger question to the civil libertarian side. I'd like to get some sense of, if assuming that this is going to pass, the 702 is going to pass, what are your major priorities for changes?
Jim, do you want to take the first part of that, maybe on the domestic use of this information, if I understood your question correctly? Yeah, okay.
Sure, okay.
Could you live without doing that?
Live without doing what?
Without being able to take the information from the foreign intelligence side and use it for some sort of domestic case?
Could we live with it or not? I don't. I would tell you that it would have a negative impact on our ability to protect the American people. I can tell you that flat out. So let me just back up and try to explain this concisely, right? So post 9/11, the edict to the FBI is connect the dots. Okay. one of the things we needed to do was try to figure out at a sort of fundamental level how to enable our analysts and agents with one database check to check all of our databases. And so over time, at the cost of a lot of money and time and effort, we have done that. And so we have figured out a way to make our various and sundry databases, more than 120 of them, accessible to an analyst or agent by a database check. One database check gets you through all that material. We have put into that FISA information, including 702 information, so that we don't, if we're worried about something and we encounter something, we don't miss that dot that might be there. And so that's what we do. That's how we operate. You have to remember that the FBI operates mainly inside the United States, and we mainly encounter U.S. persons all the time. We encounter U.S. persons, people in the United States, constantly. That's different from the other intelligence agencies, where they're operating mainly outside the U.S. and mainly dealing with non-U.S. persons. And so when we do a database check, we're probably doing a database check on a U.S. person. We often can't tell who that is. We don't know the identity. We're checking an email address or some other type of identifier, but we check it. It's probably having to do with a U.S. person. And so if there were to be this warrant requirement, it is unlikely, a warrant requiring probable cause before we can even do the check, right? That's what that means. You have to, it's a high standard of proof. We would not be able to function in that way in our national security cases or in our criminal cases, because we do these database checks across all of our lines of work. That would mean that this 702 material, we couldn't access it in the same way. We would have to figure out some way to wall it off. It would be less information available to us. It would increase the risk that something bad could happen.
You guys want to take the second part of the question?
Well, can I start on the first part too?
Sure.
So I hope, Jim, that the solution would be a relatively simple one technically, unless the databases have been designed in such a way that they are inextricable, but that you would have a separate box you would check if you have a warrant to search for U.S. persons in the 702 side of the database. I hope that would be the technical solution. But more broadly, what you described, the collation of multiple different sources of information, coming from different programs and different purposes, that's the sort of mission creep that I fear most, is the fact that this is a program that was sold to the American people as being primarily about collecting foreign-to-foreign intelligence, foreign-to-foreign communications based on a technical change in the way communications were being routed. That then shifted into being a program in large part about getting one-end U.S. person communications, but don't worry, it's still primarily about foreign intelligence and terrorism. And now it's part of a database that is used routinely by the FBI to check for evidence of any kind of crime in the U.S., whether it's significant or not, whether it relates to foreign intelligence or not. That's the world that I fear. But to answer the second part of the question quickly, I think probably the top two items for most civil liberties organizations, and I won't pretend to speak for them, would be one, to codify the end of about collection. If it's true that now the NSA itself thinks that about collection is not worth the effort, then it should be relatively uncontroversial to put an end to it legislatively and not just rely on the willful change or the voluntary change. And second would be to close the backdoor loophole that we've just been talking about. Close unwarranted access to U.S. persons' communications.
Julian, do you want to comment?
Sure. I'll largely endorse Alex's comments. I'll add that with respect to FBI queries of the 702 database, like every other intelligence agency provides an annual count of how many times they've queried their 702 take for a U.S. person identifier. It seems, and this is the one thing, the FBI is the one agency that's sort of been exempt from that, but they're also, I think, widely acknowledged to be, by at least in order of magnitude, the most frequent user of such queries. It would be, I think, the bare minimum, so we can actually discuss this in a useful or informed way, would be to get some baseline. What's the frequency with which a U.S. person identifier is used to query that database by the FBI? And if you don't want to count queries that come out with nothing, then I'm happy to actually say what I actually care about is how often are they pulling up something in response, and with what frequency is that information that's used or relevant to a non-national security crime. That's, I think, base level data we need to be able to discuss this in a useful or intelligent way. If it turns out that that number is very large, I think the results are different than if it turns out to be quite small. I suspect it's likely to be reasonably large. What I would say in general terms, while agreeing with Alex's sort of specific asks here, is look, the hard core of 702 that no one really has a problem with is the idea that you have this problem that was solved by 702 of transiting communications, foreign-to-foreign communications that pass through the U.S., but because of the way the internet works, look like essentially two one-end U.S. wire communications. They are ultimately foreign-to-foreign, but they don't look foreign-to-foreign, and no one really thinks you need a warrant for foreign-to-foreign intercepts. The solution in the FAA wasn't really narrowly tailored to solve that problem. So what I'd like to see in a kind of macro sense is whether through upfront or front-end restrictions on collection or more rigorous back-end restrictions is getting a lot closer to a solution to that problem without providing broader access to U.S. person communications.
Susan.
So just sort of a quick follow-up on the idea of codifying the ends of a ballots collection. I think this a little bit misunderstands what the NSA said whenever they announced this decision. And they didn't say it wasn't useful. They didn't say there weren't costs and potentially serious costs. They said that sort of given the circumstances in the cost-benefit analysis, this was the right decision. It would be entirely possible that there would be changes in technology that would allow compliance to be resolved more easily. There might be changes in legal authorities, or there might be changes in operational circumstances such that that information suddenly becomes more important for the United States to see. And so I think that we shouldn't view this as sort of one directional, where a decision is reached and then we codify it in law, and that's right, that's an acknowledgement that something isn't important. It should be this sort of ongoing reassessment, and so I worry about over-interpreting decisions to voluntarily stop particular forms of collection, because the world changes and technology changes.
Okay, sir, you had the next question right here. We'll wait for the mic. That way the folks watching at home can hear you better.
I'm Mike McGough from the LA Times. If the FISC is going to be protecting civil liberties in this context, is it constructed and devised the right way? Should it be a specialized permanent court, not a collection of rotating federal judges plucked from different parts of the country? And should the judges be appointed specifically by the president and confirmed by the Senate for that court, so you build up expertise around these issues?
Jim, I feel like you should get the first crack at that.
That's the last thing I want to comment on. I'm not going to comment on any particular legislative change like that.
But please, any of the other panelists who want
to me, from a civil liberties standpoint, I actually think that would be a negative outcome. I think one of the positive features of the FISC is that you have regular Article III judges making these decisions. Right, these are people who are deciding reasonable, articulable suspicion in an ordinary, open context that we all understand, and then they're doing that in a secret context. And so I actually think that that connection and that rotation is a positive thing that makes it more likely that the standards and analysis that we're seeing in a classified context look more like what we see in an open context.
Alex and Julie?
Two quick things. One is, this is probably not so far off what Susan said. I don't think the FISC is a rubber stamp. My complaint about the FISC is the way that it's structured, which I think is largely one-sided adjudication. Right? Our adversarial system is built as an adversarial one for a reason, and I think it's very difficult to meaningfully test programs of this complexity in a one-sided way. And I think that's why compliance incidents don't come up earlier, why they're not as thoroughly examined as you might like them to be, and why we've ended up with the rules that we want. But a broader point, too, if you look at some of these FISC opinions, especially this one from April, and there's another very lengthy one from November of 2011, these don't read like ordinary Article III decisions. They read more like committee reports. They read more as though the court is being asked to fashion rules of the road for the NSA. Then there's like this interchange between government and court. Not all of it is fully documented in the way it normally is in federal courts with formal filings and the like. There's informal exchange, and it looks like the back and forth that happens in committees, and the opinions read like legislation. And I think it wouldn't be a bad thing in the first instance to have most of the ground rules set at a different level in a more open forum with input from a broader set of stakeholders rather than the way that we have it now.
I think that's right. I think the part of the problem here is that the FISC was really initially designed to do something it still does, which is evaluate the adequacy of a showing of probable cause in an application for a particular wiretap. But it has sort of over time taken on a kind of second and more systemic, effectively sort of policy evaluation task that it's probably not that well equipped for. I don't know, to what extent this affects us, but it is worth noting that, right, that when you bear in mind that second function, the idea that these are all people effectively unilaterally selected by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, with the result that I think that essentially you have a mix of Republican appointees and Democratic appointees who were concessions in a horse trade but actually selected by Republicans, is not right. Is not the setup you would have if from the outset you had thought that this was going to be basically a policy-making body with a kind of weird, sort of paradoxical body of secret common law guiding its deliberations over time.
Okay, I'm going to come over here to this side of the room for if anyone has a question. No? No? Sir in the back.
Hi. So we talked a little bit about the backdoor search loophole, but I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on a specific reform. That is the metadata then warrant reform to the backdoor search loophole. So you would have the FBI being able to search its confederated databases using U.S. person queries, but it would only return metadata until the point that they get a warrant. Do you guys have thoughts on that? Do you think that's a good compromise between kind of the civil liberties and intelligence community, or are there kind of pitfalls to that approach?
And can you let us know who you are?
Oh, Austin Mooney.
Okay. All right. Who'd like to take that?
I mean, if Jim is able, he's the
Yeah, I mean,
master.
I would just comment, it's the same answer that I gave before, which was that would have a significant negative operational impact on our ability to respond quickly to the threats that we have to face today. I mean, you're adding on, just to talk about the terrorism reality for a moment, the way international terrorist groups operate has changed significantly over time, especially with ISIS, and especially their methodology of just doing sort of low-tech types of very dangerous and harmful attacks around the world. And so what we say is the flash to bang, the time from when someone becomes radicalized to the time they do something, is very compressed. So the time that we, the FBI, have to deal with terrorist threats inside the United States is much more compressed than it used to be. And so layers upon layers of reviews and sort of breakpoints and things like that, you just have to consider the impact of that. It's not up to me to tell you what the law should be. I'm just telling you that the more layers you have, the more requirements you have, the more it slows us down. You might say that's a good thing. I don't know, but it's going to slow us down. And so it's going to make it harder for us to do our job to protect the American people. I'm saying that.
I think one thing that Jim's comment reflects and is a little bit of a misperception is that, well, a warrant requirement is very easy, or you just put this standard in and then suddenly that's it seems like a simple fix. In the executive branch, a very wide sort of body of legal compliance grows out of all of those new policies and procedures, and so what in pure legislation can look like not that onerous of a standard, whenever you actually start talking about implementing it in practice, you're talking about lots of lawyers, multiple offices, needing to have lots of communications, and so what seems like you should be able to resolve it in 45 minutes, we're talking about days or weeks or sort of beyond. And so I think that's some of where the anxiety comes from in placing what seems like reasonable operational compromises on sort of the actual functioning of the system.
Julian and Alex?
I would say it's a step in the right direction, but the scheme that I would favor would be one where at the outset the government is obligated to avoid the interception of Americans' communications, and then if that system is imperfect, which it inevitably will be, it should avoid reading those communications without getting a warrant, and for either of those periods of time there might be a couple-day gap to allow the government to get a warrant. And that scheme is actually fairly similar to one that was proposed by former Senator Russ Feingold in 2008 as an amendment to the FICE Amendments Act when it was first being considered. I think that's a bit closer to the scheme that I would find acceptable, but I think that's a step in the right direction.
Julian, you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want people wasting their time, right, crafting applications and going through the hoops to submit a warrant to then find out that the answer is there's nothing there. So I think I'm okay with them at minimum knowing whether there is something responsive, so they have some sense of whether it is worth their while to craft a warrant application. So I think I could live with that. I know Liza is much more down on proposals of this sort, but she's going to have a whole keynote to tell you about why it's a bad idea.
We probably have time for about one more question. Yes, right there, Mr. Volz in the back.
Thank you, Shane. I have a question for Mr. Baker. One of the subplots surrounding the 702 debate is whether or not the intelligence community will disclose an estimate of the number of U.S. persons who are implicated in 702 surveillance. As you guys mentioned, it's meant to be a foreign intelligence program, but for a variety of technical reasons, it does ensnare many U.S. persons. The former number 2 of the NSA, Rick Leggett, came out and said that he did think an estimate would be provided to Congress and publicly by the end of the year. The House Judiciary Committee said that it was their understanding they would get an estimate early enough to inform debate, but they're still waiting. This continues to be something that privacy advocates have pushed for. I just wanted to put it to you. Does the FBI support disclosure of an estimate of the amount of U.S. persons implicated by 702, or has the agency in any way tried to push back on that effort or resist it? Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's not our job to go counting what it is that NSA has collected. So it's they have to figure that out, and it is a significant challenge. And in part, and this has been said publicly before, we often don't know who these people are that we're intercepting the communications of. And so just from looking from the outside of a communication, so, and even if you look inside of it in terms of what people are talking about, how do you know whether they're a U.S. person or not? Just because they're using a particular account, an email account or something like that. Even IP addresses are not always a perfect analogy in terms of figuring out who's a U.S. person and who's not. And so what happens, or what one of the things we have to grapple with is first of all, how much time do you want us to devote to this, and how intrusive do you want us? I'm talking about the intelligence community. How intrusive do you want us to be? You have to sort of do, in sometimes, mini investigations to just identify who the identity of the communicant. And so it actually, as you dig into these things, it becomes very difficult to provide an estimate that you would have confidence in, where the margin of error, for example, would be sufficiently low or small, I guess you would say, that you would be confident that the estimate means anything in terms of this debate. So it's a challenging problem that we have not figured out how to deal with right now.
So would you say the FBI then opposes that effort to try and get an estimate?
I'm saying there are significant challenges to trying to do that effort that we understand. Yeah.
Just to sort of follow up, I think there's there's the question of what presumption you afford to people where you don't know. So there's a risk of producing a number that ends up being misleading in some way. And so if we're going to have transparency efforts, they should inform the public. The other is a question of whether or not a number metric is actually the thing that most or best informs the American people. Right? Is knowing that number and an imperfect estimate, sort of under the best circumstances of that number. Does that really help the American people make a decision, a better judgment about how they want these programs to be constructed? I think there are other forms of transparency more related to process that go to you as an American citizen. How is your information collected? How is it used? What are your how are your rights protected, right? So getting additional transparency into those types of processes, to me, strikes me as a more meaningful form of transparency. So if we're going to be pushing on those efforts, which I think are laudable, I think there are other places to put our energy, and that these numbers have really become sort of symbolic in ways that are not constructive to the debate.
Do either of you want to respond?
I think those numbers are enormously important. I think that's why privacy advocates have been pushing for them for a while. It's why the NSA even went to the FISA court and asked for permission in its minimization procedures to do this. It actually is now consistent with the minimization procedures that the NSA has to, come up with an estimate for Congress. The most controversial aspect of 702 since its inception has been the incidental collection of U.S. persons' communications. And, in the war of terminology, I think the NSA has won by virtue of the fact that we continue to use the word incidental, which kind of in some connotation, even if not in explicit meaning, minimizes the problem and makes it seem as though it's, incidental, it's at the fringe, when in fact it may be a large, a large number of communications that are swept in.
Yeah, I think we should care about fail states. I care about the procedures that are in place to protect U.S. person information that's covered, but I also want to know what is the scale of the damage or the potential damage if there's a failure in those layers of security. So I'm interested in the number, and I don't know if the number were 150. I don't know if we would be hearing the same level of sort of suggestion that it's irrelevant. We'd probably be see how small it is.
Okay, I want to thank the audience and the panel. Hopefully, as this debate unfolds, it can be this thoughtful and respectful and engaging. Thank you to the four of you. This was really a great discussion, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break, and we will be back, and Liza Goitin will give us a keynote on civil liberties and privacy of Section 702. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Very much. Appreciate it.
One of the things I find interesting about this
And we have another brief break in this conference on the future of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. A portion of the act will expire at the end of the year. Coming up in about 15 minutes, we'll bring you remarks by then counsel to former Senator Russell Feingold, and that'll wrap up coverage of the conference, all of which will be available later to view at cspan.org. A story from Reuters earlier this month. The U.S. National Security Agency collected more than 151 million records of Americans' phone calls last year, even after Congress limited its ability to collect bulk phone records. It found that the NSA collected the records, even though it had warrants from the Secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to spy on only 42 terrorism suspects in 2016, in addition to a handful identified the previous year. The report comes as Congress faces a decision on whether to reauthorize Section 702, which permits the NSA to collect foreign intelligence information on non-U.S. persons outside the United States, and is scheduled to expire at the end of this year.